Together. The Lions Club has been around West Milford for quite a while. The Lions Club was formed in 1946 and has done some amazing things for this town since then. They even helped found and start the fire department the very next year. So the Lions Club is a really important and integral part of this town, and I don't know what we'd do without them. So I'd like to thank the Lions Club before we get started for doing all this for us. So we're here today because West Milford is 200 years old this year. And that's a pretty big deal for such a small town like this. And it has a pretty long and storied history as well that I accidentally found out. And so, in case you guys don't know, I'm Josh Toothman. I've lived here pretty much my whole life. Yeah, my mom and dad and everybody's sisters down here in the front. I'm a school teacher. Went to West Milford Elementary School, South Harrison High School. I teach West Virginia Studies right now, 8th grade in Bridgeport. And so that's where I'm coming from here. To get started, I had no idea about anything for West Milford's history. I assumed probably there was a mill here at some point in time, until I discovered a book called Grist Mills of Harrison County. Looking through the library, just looking for some things on West Virginia. And in that book, it had the story of the West Milford Mill and a guy named Bennett Ryder, who was a school teacher and a photographer. And so that's kind of how all this started for me 15 or so years ago to get us to this point. And so here, anyway, we're here to celebrate our bicentennial. And I'm going to get started. We're going to go through and talk about how this town came to be. And how we got to the point that we're all sitting in this room together today. And so I have some pictures I want to go through to help explain all this. This picture up here probably should look familiar to most people if you've lived in West Milford, although it looks a lot different than most of us remember it. This is the genesis of the town. This is where it all started. Without the West Fork River, without this spot right here, there would be no town to speak of today. And so this shallow spot in the river, which is right below the bridge in West Milford, was the only place to cross for Native Americans in the day. This was a shallow spot to cross, a ford. When the first pioneers came to settle, this was an easy place to cross the river. And so this became a place that attracted some people and also caused some problems. If you take a look at this picture up here, you'll notice all the little islands and things in the river. And that's actually what this place was called way back when. Before West Milford, the town, was even a thought in anybody's head, this place was called the Island Ford. And you can see why. The islands in the ford of the river. And so this spot brought a settler named Colonel William Lowther. Colonel William Lowther is noted as being the first pioneer settler in this area. He came over the mountains with his family near Moorfield area and settled before they came across the mountains into Hackers Creek. And he actually built a cabin just right up behind the city building today. It's on back this way a little bit, on towards Hideaway Road. And so this Lowther settlement in 1771, Colonel Lowther comes. Not too long after him, the Washburns show up. We have people, the Richards brothers show up, and they all start to cluster around his cabin. Colonel Lowther is known as the defender and protector of northwestern Virginia at that point in time. He was a pretty important person. He helped make it possible for these settlers to survive these first few years of settlement here, which was not an easy thing to do. So by 1773, we have the Richards, the Washburns, the Lowthers, the Morsons, all gathered around in this area that is now known as West Milford. And so this first picture that we're going to go to, this is Colonel William Lowther's cabin that he built, just right over here by Hideaway Road, if anybody knows where that's at. He came here in 1771. He would probably have started clearing trees, digging a well, and building this cabin. It wasn't until June of 1773 that he actually came here with his family and his pregnant wife. They settled in this cabin in June of 1773, and on July 21st, 1773, their son was born. His name was Jesse Lowther, and Jesse Lowther would grow to be the founder of this town of West Milford, and we'll get to that here in just a second. Jesse Lowther is known as the first white child, first white male child born here in what is now Harrison County. Harrison County was much, much bigger at that point in time. It included most of the counties of Lewis, Marion, and things like that. So it was a much, much bigger place. So he's considered the first white child born here in this area that would become the town's founder. And so not too long after he is born in 1773, 1773 is known as the starving year in all the history books, because these settlers all came in during this really brief point in time, and with the threat of Indian attack, they didn't really have enough time or safety to plant enough crops to feed the families that were here during that time. And so these families are starving. Colonel Lowther and some of his cohorts, the Hughes brothers, their job at that point in time, they took it upon themselves just to ride around, killing elk, buffalo, deer, which we had back then, by the way. I know it's kind of hard to think about buffalo and elk roaming around where we are now, but they were here, and somehow he kept them alive. And so as that goes on, the threat of native attack grows and grows. It becomes a really dangerous place to be during this point in time. It's hard for us to imagine today going out our front door, going to weed our gardens or whatever it is we need to do in our backyards, and having the constant threat that I might get killed at any moment, just trying to live my life and feed my family and take care of who I need to take care of. But that was the reality of the situation during that point in time. And so in 1774, 1775, Colonel Lowther with the Richards brothers, there were several of those that came around. The descendants of the Richards are still alive and all over the county. I think there's a couple here in this room today. Pretty sure there is. So what they did was they built a fort to protect themselves. This fort would have been located just a few hundred yards behind the city building that we're sitting in today. This became known as Richards Fort. And it's called Richards Fort as opposed to Fort Richards because this was a fort built by civilians. Whereas if it would have been built by the military, it would have been Fort Richards. So whenever you hear those two terms, that's how you can kind of tell who built those forts. It was a palisaded fort, which meant it had a big fence around it. And it probably had some structures inside. Of course, this was before photography, so this is an artist's rendition of what the fort might have looked like from our mural out in front. If you guys haven't had a chance to take a look at that, it's a beautiful mural that was done in the 90s when this building was open. And so anyway, when the threat of native attack was growing, they would send a rider around to all the families that lived in this area, telling them to fort up. And that meant to get your family, get your belongings, get what you need to survive for a day, a week, a month, and get inside this fort. And so a lot of the families in this area spent a lot of time inside of this place. And it would play a really important part in the history of this area and the history of the state if we really want to look through that far. And so during this time, we get to 1775, the fort is completely built. We have treaties that are made, treaties that are broken with the natives. We have all these depredations of, attacks by the settlers on the Native Americans. The Native Americans are attacking back in retribution. And so we get to this year of 1777, which is known as the year of the Bloody Sevens. This would go on for several years, and in 1778, all that caught up with the settlers that were here. And so we have a guy named Isaac Washburn. In April of 1778, Isaac Washburn is sent from the mill, or sent from this fort up to Hacker's Creek, where the only mill at that time existed, to get some grains ground into flour to bring back and feed these people, try to help feed these people that are inside this mill. On the way back, he discovers that a couple other fellows were killed near Hackers Creek, and so he rides on, tried to get back here to Richard's Fort to warn everybody inside that natives are in the area and they're on the warpath. They're on the attack. Unfortunately for Isaac Washburn, as he nears the West Fork River, near where Washburns run and Lost Creek dumps in, which is just kind of right across the river from where we're sitting, he's attacked, shot off his horse into the river, where his gun, he's got his musket, of course. That's a necessary thing back then, no matter where you're at. The attack must have happened quick because it seems that he didn't even get a shot off. He falls into the river where his gun sinks to the bottom. He struggles to get out, where he's tomahawked and killed as he climbs out of the other side of the river. And that starts a really brutal time period for this area. That's in April of 1778, and when we get to the fall of 1778, we have another Indian attack just across the river. One of the Richards brothers, Conrad Richards, his whole family is attacked by Indians. One of his real young kids are tomahawked and scalped right in front of him and his whole family. He escaped somehow to the fort to get help from Colonel Lowther and everybody inside. And it just is it's just a rough time to be alive. It's something unimaginable with our lives today and our modern lives to think about our daily lives, just trying to get food, just trying to build a house and take care of ourselves, and know that you could die at any moment if you're not paying attention. And so, a few years later, to get through the history of this fort, since this is part of the reason that the town is here today, this fort had a few names. It was called Richard's Fort, of course, but it was also called Arnold's Fort for a guy named Arnold Richards. Arnold and Paul Richards were out riding their horse one day, out hunting, doing whatever they needed to do, and the settlers that were in this fort had a cornfield that they had planted right outside the fort gate so that they had easy access to it for a food source in case they had to fort up for an extended period of time. Arnold and Paul Richards are within sight of the fort. They're almost to the fort gate, and what nobody knows is there are two natives hiding in the cornfield just waiting for an opportunity. They're both shot right off of their horses. They fall to the ground where they're tomahawked and scalped, to the horror of everybody that's inside. Arnold and Paul Richards' wives and their young children, they're all inside the fort, and they all get to see this happen. They tried to give chase, the Indians, the natives, they disappeared into the cornfield and off into the forest. And so they are buried in an unmarked grave somewhere just a couple hundred yards away from here. And so those things go on in this area for quite a while, until maybe the 1790s, when things start to calm down. The frontier pushes further to the west, and settlement becomes a more safe thing for the people in this area. And so we get back to Jesse Lowther. Jesse Lowther, that little boy is, he's 5 years old when these things are happening. He's in the fort as well because, his father helped build it. Colonel Lowther also helped build Nutter's Fort, by the way, and helped defend all that. He was seen to be everywhere at this point in time. Anytime we have these stories of these native attacks, Colonel Lowther is there either as it's happening or rides up. It's right after it happened. And it seems like that's the story that plays out all over the place. And so anyway, that threat of native attack goes away eventually. Jesse Lowther is growing up. He gets married. And in 1807, Jesse Lowther does something that changes the course of history for this town. He buys a farm. He buys 107 acres from a guy named George Bush. Or another story says that he traded a barrel of whiskey and a pair of silk hose to this George Bush for this property. I don't know which story is true, but I kind of like the second one a little better. So anyway, this 107 acres is his farm. By the way, he grows up in this cabin as the Lowthers get married and have children. They add an extra cabin off to the side. This is what it looks like before it was torn down there for a while. So in 1807, he gets this farm, the Island Ford Farm, which is where the town of West Milford stands today. Jesse Lowther notices something as he's farming his new farm, and he builds a cabin which would have been located today right about in the center of West Milford, somewhere around the back, from what I've been able to find out, somewhere around the back of where the Dollar General store is today. And so he lives there with his wife, having children, farming, and he notices all of these people from the surrounding area crossing the river. From the first picture I showed you, across that ford in the river where the islands are, and coming up through his farm to travel back and forth across the river to do their business, going to Clarksburg and back. And he realizes that this is a place that will attract a lot of people. It's the only place to cross the river back then for miles upstream or downstream. And so he comes up with this idea. In 1815, he decides that he's going to take part of his farm and turn it into a town. And so he gets this a young boy named Samuel Hoff. He's 13 years old, and Samuel Hoff and Jesse Lowther lay out 10 acres of his farm into lots for houses and streets. Same streets that we have today. If you drive down Main Street, Back Street, or Mill Street, most of what we know it today. Those are the same streets that he laid out in 1815. Even that little crook in the bottom of Main Street that we all know today, it was there back then. For whatever reason, that was there. It's still there today. And so Samuel Hoff and him lay out the town in 1815. Samuel Hoff was born just across the river from West Milford, just across the river from the bridge today, in a place that his father built, John Hoff, called the Dixie Homestead. He lived there. They had a handful of slaves that helped them run the property, and they were friends with the Lowthers. And so at 13 years old, he helps them lay out this town. And people come here instantly. People want to come, and they start buying lots, and they realize they have a problem. One of the problems is that it's hard to get wood back then. It's hard to get things to build a house. So Jesse Lowther decides to do something that even further changes the course of history, and he decides to sell 2 acres of that 10 acres of his farm that he divided into lots for this town to a guy named Samuel Clemens and his partner Jacob Romine. And he sells them these 2 acres so that they can build a dam across the river to power a sawmill and a grist mill. And that changes everything. From that moment, the people in this area have a place to take their grains to be ground into flour to feed their families. And now they have a place to get their logs sawed into lumber so they can start building houses and barns and turn those into homes and places to raise their family. And from that point on, there was no turning back. This place became a magnet for people in the area, and people came here to build houses and raise families, and some of those are still here today. This house might look familiar to a lot of you all as you leave West Milford. McDaniel House is what most people know it as today. This was actually the house built by Samuel Hoff. That 13-year-old boy in 1815 that helped Jesse Lowther lay out this town built this house sometime around 1830, where he raised his family. So we do have this direct connection to that link here in this town. So it's a pretty old place. And most of you recognize this, I hope. And so that mill, owned by Samuel Clemens, that partnership with him and Jacob Romine only lasts for a brief period of time. Jacob Romine decides he wants to do his own thing. He sells out his part of the mill and goes to a place and builds his own, and that place now is called Romine's Mills. Some of you all probably know where that's outside of Lost Creek. So that's how that came to be as well. Samuel Clemens continues on his own for quite a long time. This is the original mill that was built by Samuel Clemens and remodeled and added on to over the years. This is what was referred to in all the history that I have as the old timer. This one would last for quite a while, and we'll get to how this mill came to its end here in just a few minutes as we go along. And so when this mill was built by Samuel Clemens, originally this town was unofficially known as Island Ford. That was the original name of this town. Once this mill was built, the people started calling this place Clemens Mill. That was the name of this town for the first few years of its life. In 1818, they apply for a charter, and it takes a few years to get there. And so on January 15th, 1821, the Viginia Assembly that's operating out of Richmond in the government decides to officially enact the town of Milford, Virginia. And it's spelled Milford with two L's, Millford. And so that is why we're here today. We're here today because on January 15th, 1821, West Milford officially became a town that was recognized by the state of Virginia. And so that is the origins of the town of West Milford. And so once that happens, this town begins to grow and change pretty quickly. In 1836, I have a little description of the town and what it would have been like. And so you can imagine, you guys all know what the town of West Milford is like today. But this is what it was like in 1836, when the town was about 15 years old. And here's the description that was written about this town. It says, "This village is pleasantly situated on the north bank of the West Fork of the Monongahela River. It contains 15 dwelling houses, one house of public worship, which was Methodist, one house of public entertainment." I'm not sure what that would have been. We can all probably imagine. One miscellaneous store, one tan yard, so we had a tannery. We had a boot and a shoemaker. We had a gunsmith. We had one house carpenter. We had one cooper. And if you don't know what that is, that's somebody who makes barrels. That was an important thing back then. We had a grist and a sawmill. This was it. It says the products they grew here were wheat, Indian corn, rye, oats, flax, hemp, and various kinds of pulse and vegetables. I had no idea what pulse was. It's things like peas and such. So that's how they did their business, how they raised their crops, and how they kept alive back then. The population of West Milford in 1836 was 61. And that odd one was a slave. So somebody had one here. It also said the neighborhood is thickly settled and bids fair to be a thriving country should a market ever open to this place. The post office has lately been moved from Milford to Lost Creek. And so this is where we get something that we're stuck with today, which is a good thing. And so in 1836, when that post office was moved from West Milford to Lost Creek, it stayed there until about 1844. In 1844, West Milford applied to get the post office back. And in Washington, D.C., they agreed. But they found out that there was already another Milford in Virginia. And you can't have two, because your mail, you never know where your mail is going to go. This other Milford, by the way, is about 40 miles southwest of Washington, D.C., and it's still there today. It's a lot smaller than, it's a little smaller than our town, if you can imagine that. But it still exists. And so the people of the town, they decided to not change the name, that since we're in the western part of Virginia, we just call ourselves West Milford. At that particular time, for some reason, that second L that was in the original spelling disappeared, and that gives us the West Milford that we still have today. And so that's how the town got its name. Those were the four names. We started out as Island Ford. We changed to Clemens Mill. That we were Milford for a little bit, and now we've been West Milford for, way over 100 years. And so that's how West Milford got its name. And so it talks about if a market ever opened up to this place. And that market did come. That market would be involved with the river and this mill. But also in 1850, West Milford got put on a project called the West Milford to New Salem Turnpike. This would have been like the I-79 of its day. And so what it did was, with horses and wagons. And so it became the main highway to get from the Northwestern Turnpike, which is today Route 50, to the Staunton-Parkersburg Turnpike, which is pretty much Route 33 from Weston and through the mountains at that point. And so it came across Sycamore Road, straight down Main Street of West Milford, through the river, in the ford, up the other side and up Duck Creek and on to Lewis County and beyond. This put us on the main thoroughfare of anybody traveling back and forth during that time period. When West Milford found out that they were going to, by the way, here's a picture of the town and what it looked like before a bridge was ever here. This is Main Street. Y'all can see the little crook in the bottom of Main Street. You can see today the bridge would be right there in front, going in between those two poles and up and out of the river and up Main Street. And so when West Milford and the citizens found out that they were going to build this turnpike, they were going to use this as an excuse to build a bridge. They thought, this is our chance. And so they formed this company called the Harrison Bridge Company to build a bridge. They raise all this money, they get the county to agree to help fund it, to take over the debts and build it, and then the Civil War comes. And so all those funds that were set out to build this first West Milford Bridge never came to be because the money and the youth and the young men of the community that would have been building this bridge to span this ford were off fighting in the Civil War. And so this is going to take a while for West Milford to get its first bridge. So here in West Milford, just like everywhere in West Virginia, we had families that sent their young men off to fight for the Confederates, and we also had families that sent their children off to fight for the Union. Some within the same family. We would have stories of brothers in families around here that would split. One would fight for the Confederate, another would fight for the Union Army. And so we have a couple of those. This is a Union Civil War soldier from West Milford, a guy named Lysander Jackson Ayers. Uncle Jack is what most people call him. This is him in later life. He was a Union cavalry soldier in the Civil War. In August of 1864, he finds himself in a battle in Moorfield. He's shot 7 times. Once through the neck that enters and exits out through his armpit, once through the collarbone, but he's shot 7 times, and he's left for dead on the battlefield in Moorfield. He's drug up onto a porch of a Southern sympathizer right next to the battlefield, where he lays all day and all night. Several other members of his unit die on that porch that night as he lays there, thinking he's bleeding to death. And the next morning, they take him inside, tend to his wounds, and it takes a while for him to recover. He recovers after a few months from those 7 bullet wounds, almost dead on the battlefield. He comes back home to West Milford to vote for Abraham Lincoln for his second term. And then he goes and he finds where his company is, and he rejoins his company to fight to the end of the Civil War. While his company is stationed near Washington, D.C., he gets to meet and shake hands with Abraham Lincoln. And so that was a story that he was pretty proud of and would tell the people of West Milford. I have an interview from a newspaper that he gave shortly before his death, where he talks about not only once, but a couple, 2 or 3 times, he got the chance to meet and shake Abraham Lincoln's hand. That was a common occurrence. Lincoln had a habit of wanting to go out and review the troops to keep the morale up while they were stationed around Washington, D.C. And so we have a guy in West Milford, a citizen of our town, that actually got to shake the hand of Abraham Lincoln. And that's pretty amazing just to think about that. And so we have him as one of those representatives of the town during the Civil War, during this period. We also are on this place called the West Milford to New Salem Turnpike, and we have a constant stream of Union soldiers coming from Weston to from Weston to Clarksburg, back and forth. So we have a lot of Civil War soldiers passing through the town. A lot of the people in the town let them stay and sleep in their houses, cooked them food, took care of them, and then the next day they would get up and be on their way back to Clarksburg, back to Weston, whatever it was. We also have a guy from the other side as well. This is Lewis Ross Hoff, the son of Samuel Hoff, the little boy who helped Jesse Lowther lay out this town. He was actually a Confederate cavalry soldier with the 17th Virginia. He found himself at the Battle of Gettysburg. And the 17th Virginia, which consisted of a lot of soldiers from this area, found themselves further north than any other cavalry unit during the Civil War at the outbreak of the Battle of Gettysburg. He survived. He makes it all the way to the end, to Lee's surrender at Appomattox, which by the way, Jackson Ayers, in his interview says he was there. He was at the surrender of Robert E. Lee. His company, Union Cavalry, were there at the surrender at Appomattox. And in his interview, he says he witnessed Lee's surrender as him and Grant left the house after the signing of the surrender agreement. And so he was one of those troops. And there was a lot of people there. They were chasing Lee down and they were surrounding him. So there was a lot there. But he says he was one of those soldiers that was actually there at Appomattox in April of 1865 as the Civil War came to a close. And so we have these two representatives of Union and Confederate soldiers here in West Milford. And so after the Civil War, they pick up their push to build a bridge. That's something that the town really, really wanted and needed. They thought it would really open up this town to business traffic and help people in this town to expand and help themselves. So in 1865, things really start to change after the Civil War for West Milford. One of the changes come from this fellow. I told you guys earlier that when I got interested in West Milford and local history, I came across a fellow by the name of Bennett Ryder. He was a school teacher and a photographer. He was a different kind of guy from back then. He was considered somewhat of a genius of his day. They said from a tiny boy, he would take things apart like clocks, take them completely apart, guns, put them back together, build things that nobody else could build around here. And so Bennett Ryder actually came to Sycamore. And so all of you came in here to eat breakfast this morning, you passed this flag. And so during the Civil War, Bennett Ryder and his wife built this little place right at the intersection of Route 19 and Sycamore. We all passed this on our way to Clarksburg, and today there's nothing there. Nothing there to remember that this is here. And so as they find out in the middle of the Civil War that West Virginia is going to break away and form its own state from Virginia, he comes up with an idea. He wants to design a flag to commemorate this new state coming into being and to support the Union troops because they are staunch Unionists and abolitionists as well. And so he designs this flag, buys all the material, and his wife and her friends of Sycamore sew it all together. That's the flag that we have out front here today. That was made in 1863 and flown on a flagpole right next to his, this is his store, post office, photographer studio in his house, all in one there at the end of Sycamore. And so they fly this flag above this store, and as Civil War, as Union soldiers pass by on their way back and forth to Clarksburg, they have a young son named Clarence. This little guy here, he's about 3 years old, and every time Union soldiers would be passing by, he would run out on the porch of this little store. They made his own little flag for him to carry, and he would run out on this little porch. You can see little Clarence sitting there on the porch today. This was in 1863, during the Civil War. Mrs. Ryder there to the left. Bennett is taking the photograph. And so he would run out whenever he heard the soldiers coming, because they made a lot of noise. He would run out on this little porch waving his own flag, yelling hurrah for the Union, which they write it as Uni, U-N-I-N-G, because he's 3 years old and can't pronounce the word Union. And so that is why we have this flag out here in the foyer today. If you didn't pay any attention to it walking in, it's definitely worth a look. It's all hand sewn. If you look at it closely, it looks like it's done with a machine today. It's amazing handiwork that is an art form that is kind of dying out. So after the Civil War, they bring that flag with them here to West Milford because Bennett Ryder buys the old West Milford mill. We can see that here in this picture from around that time period. You can kind of see the dam at the bottom. That's the sawmill in the front. The bigger in the back is the grist mill. Bennett Ryder was also a gunsmith. Could fix anything you want on your gun, do anything at all like that. And so he's here at West Milford during the Civil War, or right after the Civil War. He comes here in 1865 until his death in the 1880s. And as he's a miller, and he still has his hobbies of fixing and repairing guns. I told you guys, if you remember, about a fellow named Isaac Washburn. In 1778, being shot off of his horse, fell into the deep water of the West Fork River right here. His gun sank to the bottom. He tries to escape where he's tomahawked and killed. And that was kind of the end of the story. I had heard that story and I always thought, well, that would be amazing. I wonder what happened to that gun. Is it still at the bottom of the West Fork River today? And so, as I kept researching and looking for things of West Milford history, I found some family letters and some family information from Bennett Ryder that was left behind and passed down through the generations. And so during Bennett Ryder's time, probably in the 1870s, early 1880s, this is 90 years or so after Isaac Washburn was killed and his gun sank to the bottom of the West Fork River. There were some boys down in the West Fork seining for minnows to go fishing, and they got snagged on something. What they got snagged on was an old flintlock rifle, and so they pulled it out of the bottom of the river, and they know Bennett Ryder is an expert gunsmith. And so these boys, this would have been 1870s, 1880s, they bring it to Bennett Ryder. He inspects the gun, determines that it had to have been Isaac Washburn because nobody else was shot and killed and had his gun sunk to the bottom of the river at this particular place. And so he inspects the gun. He unscrews the breech pin and finds out that inside of that breech pin, 90 years later, after sitting at the bottom of that river, is still the bullet, the powder, and the wad. And so I found out that story, and it made me wonder, well, now that the gun was found in the river and brought to Bennett Ryder, I wonder if it's still around today. And so, Terry, you around here? So we have Terry Washburn. That last name should sound familiar with the story I'm telling you. Terry, do you want me to tell him, or do you want to just get it out and show him? And so the other night, we're having a meeting to talk about all this stuff that's going on today. And Terry shows up, and he's got some things wrapped in paper. And we go about having our meeting, and we get done talking about the business of our meeting. And I asked Terry, I say, Terry, what you got in the bag? And so he proceeds to unwrap something, and what he unwraps is Isaac Washburn's gun. The very gun that sank to the bottom of the river the day in 1778 that he was shot and tomahawked and scalped by the Indians. The very gun that sat at the bottom of the West Fork River for 90 years before it was seined out by these little boys and taken to Bennett Ryder is still in the hands of the family descendants, which Terry is, by the way. And so he was gracious enough to share this part of his family history with us and bring that with us today. It's even got the bullet, the powder wad, and everything that was found inside of it is still in existence today, which he has in a little box. And this is, and you think I'm going to lay this out here later so they can walk by and take a look at it? Maybe? And so we'll take a look. There's not a whole lot left of it. It's a piece of the stock. Yeah, and in the little box is the bullet and the linen patch from Isaac Washburn's gun. Bennett Ryder found it in the exact state of preservation as it was that day in 1778. That morning before, I suppose that morning before Isaac Washburn got on his horse to ride to that mill and come back, he packed that he packed that final shot that he never got off, and it's still here today, right here in this little box. On this little piece of the gun, the breech pin that Bennett Ryder unscrewed to find that is still here, still works, still in existence. You can see it's definitely seen better days, but definitely a piece of history. This is what I love about local history. I asked Terry how he found out about this, and you said that you saw it in a newspaper article, right?
Read this.
Yeah. Go ahead. He's going to read something to you, and then
I used to teach at Lewis County High School, and I read the Western Democrat paper every week. And Bill Adler had an article in there one time. Yeah, Bill Adler had an article in the Western Democrat about this gun being found. All the boys were saying it for Menace and Bennett Ryder identifying it and everything. I thought, wonder what happened to that gun? So I asked my aunt, telling her the story, and she said, I bet I know where that gun is. I said, you did? She said, yeah. I said, I'll show you one of these days. And so she did. And I wound up with it. The remnants, where's that deputy sheriff here a minute ago? We got an unsolved homicide. We never did figure out who killed him. I've got evidence here, but the chain of custody is a little bit fuzzy. Late in the 19th century, 1870, sailing for Menace in the West Fork River, these boys found this rifle. That Isaac Washburn had been killed there by the Shawnees in 1778. They brought it to Bennett Ryder, the miller at the West Milford Mill, who identified it as that of Isaac Washburn. It is believed that my great-grandfather, Anson Luther Washburn, acquired this from Bennett Ryder. Anson Luther was a farmer, a U.S. Army veteran, Company F, 7th West Virginia Infantry in the Civil War, and he was a great-great-nephew of Isaac Washburn. We believe that Anson Luther passed it down to Charles H. Washburn. Now we know that Charles H. Washburn definitely had it, because he was born in 1875 after the gun was found and identified. So had to have been come to his father, I'm sure, or reasonably sure that's how it got here. Charles Washburn, my grandfather, was a local historian. He passed it down to his daughter, Catherine Washburn Whiting, who was a social issue crusader and a local historian. She and I came down here in the 1960s. Anybody remember the advertisement for the Polaroid Swinger? Meet the Swinger, Polaroid Swinger. I came down with my Polaroid Swinger I'd gotten for Christmas. We took pictures of the bridge where the abutments was falling out from under, and we went to the governor's office and raised all kinds of hell and got the work started to get a new bridge in West Milford that's here today. Aunt Katie passed it down to me, Terrence Lee Washburn, the great-great-great-great-nephew of Isaac Washburn, U.S. Army veteran, me, farmer, environmentalist, and amateur historian. It's my desire to permanently loan this to the town of West Milford. Here in the bicentennial year of its founding, for the appropriate, secure, and reverent display as an artifact of local interest, if the town declines to display it, the rifle remnants in a small labeled box should be offered to a local museum or library for display, or returned to me or my descendants or other descendants of Charles H. Washburn, who has an appreciation of it. Terrence Lee Washburn, July 31st, 2021.
So this is what I love about local history and things like this. By coincidence, Terry got to see that newspaper article, and he was curious about it. He could have not cared at all, and that would have been forgotten, and that would have been the end of the story. But Terry was curious, and he liked history, and so he asked some questions. And those questions led to him being here with this piece of history today, an amazing piece of history. Just one little thing, and it would have been gone forever. Nobody would have had a clue it still existed. And that's the neat thing about local history. You get to talk to people in your community when they know that you're interested in history, and they are too. People want to share things with each other. And so I can't tell Terry how much I'm amazed by this story and his generosity in not only bringing this today, but wanting to permanently share this with not only the community of West Milford, but the state of West Virginia in general. This is a crucial and important part and relic of not only West Milford history, but West Virginia or pioneer Virginia history as well. And so, much appreciation there, Terry. So, we're going to allow you guys to take a look at this as we leave here in a minute before we get ready to carry on our day, but I have a little bit of story left. I know I'm kind of going on. I know if you guys were 13 years old in my class, you'd probably be wishing Mr. Toothman would just cut it off right now and let me go. That's how that would be happening right now.
I'm enjoying it.
Okay, so West Milford in the 1870s starts to change with Bennett Ryder and his influence on the town, and we have some images of the town. This image is one of those saddle shops down on Water Street. Here on the right would be Ed Reynolds Saddle Shop, and that building on the left with the sign out front was some place called the Fox Inn and Tavern. This is a hotel where you can come and stay the night, board your horse, get a home-cooked meal, get a glass of whiskey, and spend the night. So we had this place here as well. I mean, we watch these movies that take place in the 1800s, you know, we see these towns with dirt streets and these little taverns and things, and West Milford was truly that kind of place that you would see on one of those movies. Berta Lynch said that people were so proud of this town and its growth and what it meant to them. Everybody had their own little gate that they would handcraft. This is an example of one of those gates that would serve a couple of purposes. Number one, it made your house look better, but also kept if somebody's horse broke loose and wandered to town, it would keep them out of your vegetable garden, it would keep them out of your flower garden, and out of your front lawn. And so this is an example of that. This is the Ryder family at the house that used to be down by the dam called the Mill Cottage. So finally, West Milford, in the 1875, West Milford finally gets their bridge built. I've only been able to find one copy of the picture. The first bridge in West Milford was a wooden covered bridge, much like the one in Philippi. You can see this is the bridge under construction. The bridge has been covered with wood and the roof on the right side. And you can only see the frame structure to the left that hasn't been covered yet. You can also see those islands in the river that are still there today. This bridge would have been built in the exact same place that our bridge is today, right on Main Street. And so it took them about 25 years to get this covered bridge built. They were extremely proud of it. But unfortunately, fate had other plans for this bridge. And so about 13 years after it was built, in July of 1888, a huge rainstorm came. Flooded West Milford, flooded at 27 feet. Huge amount of water. What it did was take the West Milford Mill, rip it off of its foundation, swept it out into the middle of the river and downstream where it crashed into the covered bridge, destroying both of them. During that time, Bennett Ryder had already sold the mill and moved up the street. I'll show you his house in a minute, to a guy named Wesley Post. Wesley Post became the new miller along with his partner, Thomas West. And this was the house that they added the mill cottage that we just tore down and added onto it. The river came up so quick and so fast that the townspeople had to rescue Wesley Post, the head miller, and his family in a boat from those upper story windows. In a boat, they pull him off to safety, and the whole town gathers around, and they watch the disaster play out right in front of them. His whole life seems destroyed right in front of his eyes. And so now, in 1888, in the summer of 1888, West Milford finds itself without a bridge and without a mill for lumber or grinding your grains into flour. And it's a tough time, but West Milford citizens, I've heard them described as being tenacious and undeterred at that point in time. And so it takes them barely a year, and within a year they have a brand new mill built, which is this one. This is probably the most common picture that people see of the West Milford Mill. They equip it with this new thing called the roller system. Big roller mills that can produce up to 50 barrels of flour a day, which really increase production. And at the same time, which I know it's hard to see, they replaced the old covered bridge with that old one-lane iron bridge that many of you out there probably still remember today as West Milford's second bridge. So it took them barely a year, and West Milford was back up and going and better than ever. They kept on moving on. And so this mill continues on for quite a while. Bennett Ryder moves just up the street into this house, which still stands today. From the upper story windows and the front porch of this house, on special occasions, they would hang this flag that's out in the foyer for display, that 1863 flag. So that flag hung here in West Milford as well for many occasions back during that time period. West Milford continued to grow and change. In 1883, West Milford, think about what I read to you earlier, West Milford had 4 church buildings now, a fine schoolhouse, 3 general stores, a furniture store, 2 saddle shops, a blacksmith, 3 blacksmiths, 2 wagon and carriage shops, 2 shoe shops now instead of just 1, a hotel, 3 doctors, 4 preachers, and 1 lawyer. That was West Milford in 1883 during this time of Bennett Ryder and his influence in the town of West Milford. So, a couple more things before I finish up, because I can't let West Milford history go without talking about this lady here. Most people realize that most higher education was denied to women for a long time. The right to vote was denied to women beyond everybody else in this country. Medical college, medical schools were denied to women until the Johns Hopkins opened it up to the first few women in the late 1890s. But here in West Milford, we have a lady named Susan Dew Hoff. Susan Dew, her father was Dr. Dew. He operated here in West Milford, and Susan, his daughter, was a young girl, 10, 12, growing up. She would go with her father on house calls and help him with his doctorate. And so she learned a lot from her father growing up. She gets married to a guy named James Hoff, who was brother to Lewis Ross Hoff, the Civil War soldier I showed you, and son or grandson, I can't remember right now, to Samuel Hoff, the guy who designed the town. And she gets married, has children. She's in her late 30s, early 40s. Her father dies. And not too long after her father dies, Susan Dew Hoff has a dream. She has this dream that her father comes to her in her dream and gives her his old medical bag, the black medical bags the doctors carried back then, and his cane, and says, "Susan, finish my work." That's the dream she has. So she wakes up from that dream and gives it some thought, tells her husband and her brother, who's also a doctor, about the dream, and I'm going to try. And they all laugh at her. I'll tell her there's no way you're going to become a doctor, you're a woman, this and that. And so what she does is she goes and she gets her father's old medical books, and she studies and studies and studies for years. Several years she studies while she's raising her young children. And so she decides to petition Wheeling, the state medical board in Wheeling, to let her take the test. Never went to medical school, wasn't allowed. She just learned from her father growing up, and then learned by studying those books of her father's by herself. She gets on a train here in Clarksburg and travels to Wheeling in April of 1889. She not only passes the test, but she passes the test with one of the best scores that the state had ever seen at that point in time. They issue her doctor's certificate, which is handwritten, and they have to scratch out all the Mr. and all the his and rewrite her and Mrs. into it so that it fits her, because they've never done that before. And she becomes the first licensed female doctor in the state of West Virginia. She comes home, shows her new certificate to her husband and her brother that made fun of her. Says, "See that? and goes home and goes about her business, has no intention of actually becoming a doctor. Just goes back to her life. But what happens is people find out about this. Her father's old patients find out, and they start coming to her and asking her and wanting help. And so she realizes that the community needs her, and so she starts her own practice, which she serves here in West Milford for over 40 years, riding horseback to patients' homes when they couldn't come to her. The house that she had that dream in is actually the Summers house today, where our mayor and his wife, Councilwoman Jackie, live today. After her husband died and her kids got older, they bought her this little house. Everybody recognize this little house? So she moves down, they buy her this house, and she moves into this house where she lives and has her doctor's office until the day she dies. She's buried in the West Milford Cemetery, the Rose Hill Cemetery. You can see this is her gravestone here to the right. And the third one to the left, the little house-looking one, that is the gravestone of her father, which is in the shape of his medical bag. So if you ever go out to the cemetery and walk around and wonder why they made it in the shape of that, that's why. He was a doctor, and that was his medical bag that he carried on patients that long ago. And so West Milford becomes a town that is really, education is really important. We have other people move into town, along with Dr. Susan Duhoff. We have another guy that moves into town, a guy named Dr. Latham Davidson. Right here on Main Street, across from the Methodist Church, he opens this hotel called Mineral Springs Hotel. He's a doctor. He's also self-taught. Here to the right is his apothecary shop where he made medicines for the town, and this over to the left is a hotel. People came from all over, even out of state, for treatment for diphtheria and tuberculosis. And so he discovers just down the road here, about a half a mile, is a spring. A lot of people might have got water out of that spring back in the day. That spring is known as Mineral Springs. He actually built bathhouses, and he would take his patients that would come here to stay in his hotel and treat them. He would take them down the road here and let them soak in the mineral waters that is just right down here. I know as a kid, I would ride my bike in the summer, and some of my friends would make it all the way down there to get water out of that spring. A lot farther than I was probably allowed to go. But I never told anybody, and nobody else did either, so we never got in trouble for it. It's just about a half a mile down the road here on the right, just before you get to the Highland Bridge. It's still there today, by the way. You can still go get water out of it. Still works, still cold spring water coming out of it. But back then there would have been bathhouses for his patients to soak. He treated them with all kinds of treatments, and that was just one of them. And so that would have been on Main Street of West Milford during that time. Him and Susan Duhoff become one of the leading doctors in treating tuberculosis at that time, until her death in the 1930s. So I'm about to finish up here, and I want to finish up in the early 1900s. I know I'm not going to get to the modern times, but in 1910, West Milford almost ceased to exist. In 1910, what happened was the whole state of West Virginia, the timber industry was clear-cutting the entire state of West Virginia, which was creating these massive floods in downtown Pittsburgh. And so they traced the source of these floods back to the hills of West Virginia being clear-cut and timbered. And so they come up with this plan. One part of the plan was to create the Monongahela National Forest to regrow the trees to hold the water back so that the town of Pittsburgh doesn't get flooded and shut the steel industry down. And then they also came up with all these other plans for flood control and reservoirs. So in 1910, in Pittsburgh, the Army Corps of Engineers came up with a plan to create a lake. And that lake would have been about the exact same size as Stonewall Jackson Lake today, except it was going to be right here. Here's a map of that proposed lake. The dam, which you can see to the far left, would have been down at Laurel Park. And it would have created a lake similar in size to today's Stonewall Jackson Lake. You can see Lost Creek, Sycamore Creek, Isaacs Creeks, all would have been part of this lake. And you can also see the town of West Milford. If this plan would have went through, West Milford starting in 1911 when they built this dam, West Milford would have been forever at the bottom of this lake. And right now, today, we would be sitting with water way above our heads. But the townsfolk of West Milford decided that they weren't having it. And so they fought and protested and fought, and they got the Army engineers to drop this plan. By the way, the lake would have extended from here, where the dam would have been, here just down the road in Laurel Park, all the way to the tailwaters would have been just before the town of Weston. That would have been the size of this lake. And so the lake edge, if you were standing on the playground at the elementary school at the swings, you would just have to take a couple steps forward and your feet would be in the water. So that West Milford would have been done. West Milford would have been off the map at that point in time and gone forever. And luckily, the citizens at the time decided to do something else. They decided to turn their focus to education. They made learning and education their priority and point of pride. And so instead of that dam being built and that lake flooding the town of West Milford in 1910, they built this school. And this school would turn in to unite us and grow over the years. By the way, this has been on the playground of the school today. If you drive by, this is where this would have been. And so the lifestyle of that first 100 years of being reliant on a grist mill and a sawmill to feed your family and get wood to build your barns died in 1912. On May 1st, 1912, the West Milford Mill was ran for a final time and then abandoned. Edmund Steele. It sat empty for many years until it was bought by the Clarksburg Water Board. Clarksburg Water Board had a president and general manager at that time by a guy named Scott Highland, who was from West Milford. And so he did a few things. Number one, you can see this is about 1919, 1920. Everybody remembers the old dam that just got torn down, the old concrete dam. You can see that they are building that dam right here. You can see the workers and scaffolding to build that dam. The abandoned mill, which looks like it's suffered some fire damage, is torn down and is gone forever. Almost. Scotland Highland, as the general manager of the water board, not only does he build the West Milford Dam that we all know, but he also builds Buffalo Lake during this time period. As he tore down the millstones were still inside. And so he takes one of those millstones and he takes it to Clarksburg and he puts it on the lawn of the Clarksburg Water Board, where it sat for 100 years almost. And the other millstone, because it takes two to grind grain, you have to have two, an upper and another. The other one he put in the yard of his house on Upper Main Street, which most of you have seen this driving by. The house in the background was his house. So Scotland Highland lived there, traveled back and forth to Clarksburg as the water board general manager, and that's why we have these stones today. And so that other stone that was in Clarksburg for all those years is now back home in West Milford where it belongs, and it's right out front here in the lawn of the community building. So if you're wondering what that is, that's what it is. It is the final millstone of this old West Milford mill. That's so now we have both of them here at the house, or at our town. And so that brings me to my last photograph, which is exactly the same as the first photograph, but in color. And so it's kind of a weird coincidence that today that we're celebrating our bicentennial, that two things look and are about exactly like they were way back in 1807 when Jesse Lowther bought this property or traded this property for that barrel of whiskey and that pair of silk hose. For the first time in over 200 years, the West Fork River here at West Milford looks like it looked for thousands and thousands of years before. Also, the town has expanded its boundaries from that original 10 acres. It is now almost that exact 107 acres that Jesse Lowther first bought back in 1807. The property boundary would have been this road that leads down to the PSD at that point in time. So West Milford now, 200 years later, in a couple of ways, is exactly the way it was 200 or more years ago, now, today that we sit here and celebrate our bicentennial. So, I'll open this up to some questions. If anybody has any, I'll try to answer them. But that's the end of my presentation. I want to thank you guys for being patient. Hopefully I wasn't too long-winded. I know, when you get into history, you tend to want to talk about things because it's what you're interested in. So I'm assuming that since you're here today, you are too. So I want to thank you guys for your patience. I want to thank you guys for listening to me today. Hopefully you learned something. If you want to find out more about West Milford, I did put together a book for our bicentennial that details everything I've talked about and a whole lot more. It brings us all the way up to this year of 2021. It spans that whole time period. And so we have those. I think they'll be out front or somewhere here today during the festival. So anyway, happy birthday, West Milford. Here's to 200 more, hopefully. And I appreciate your all's patience. And if anybody has any questions, let me know. Raise your hand. I'm a teacher. If you shout it out at me, I'll probably ignore you because that's my habit. Terry?
Just want to comment or two, the picture of the school with the horse tied in front of it.
Yeah.
I may have a connection to that horse.
Learning history, I love it.
My aunt was born on the farm that I now live on. The lady that gave me the rifle. And she was delivered by Dr. Toothman. She rode a horse when I drove her to school.
Yeah, you never know. So this river is the thread that's woven through our entire history. It's the thread that connects our culture and the history of our town from the beginning until today and will beyond into the future. Amazing. West Fork River.